problem sufficiently. So thank you. We'll come to our next person. One question while you're going to come up next. Yes.
Right. What was the nature of the tax reform that would be necessary?
The main tax reform that we have seen work somewhere is essentially something like regional tax-based sharing, which only has please come and change.
You take the mic.
Oh, I have to. Yeah, regional tax-based sharing, which is Minneapolis, St. Paul has been able to implement, but has not been able to be implemented in other places. So.
I'm figuring it out as I go here.
That's very good. You're doing quite well.
Hi, everybody. I'm Joe Grangs. I teach urban planning at the University of Michigan as well. As you can see from the title of my slide, I'm going to be talking about transportation, and more specifically, as it relates to social injustice. And I'm going to claim that transportation engineers and planners have been using the wrong tools now for decades. And the use of these wrong tools actually make Southeast Michigan come out looking pretty good. And I'm going to suggest a completely different way of thinking about transportation. And when we think about transportation in this different way, it turns out then that Southeast Michigan comes out looking not very good at all. And in order to make progress, we have to start thinking differently about transportation in the following way. We have been stuck in a sort of single-minded determination in evaluating the success of a transportation system based almost entirely on faster movement. That is, if we can get vehicles to move fast between point A and point B, we deem that success. And there are lots of examples of how this comes into our field. The Highway Capacity Manual and many of our regulations use these measures like level of service, volume to capacity ratios. There's all sorts of measures, and it ultimately boils down to how fast we can move from point A to point B. That is what I call the mobility-centered view of transportation policy. And I'm going to talk today about a completely different way, an accessibility-based view of transportation policy, which thinks of transportation not in terms of how easy it is to move from point A to point B, but rather, this is a slight distinction, but how easy it is to reach destinations. All right, so the ability to reach destinations deals with interaction, and our interaction forms the basis of why we have cities. Why human beings invented cities to begin with is all about interaction. So from ancient times, when cities sprung up at the crossroads of trading routes, it was because people wanted to come together face to face and engage in commerce and to engage with one another. And all through the history of cities, it's been about how well we can get to the people that we want to see, our family and friends, to the banks and the grocery stores and the child care centers that we need to interact with day to day, and of course getting to jobs. That's interaction, and that's what accessibility measures. What this different way of thinking brings into the equation is not just infrastructure of roads of how we move from one point to the next, but rather what we get for the movement that we do. All right, so Detroit actually comes out, the Detroit metropolitan region comes out looking pretty good in the mobility-centered view. So in terms of vehicle miles traveled per capita, that is how much we actually move around each day, Detroit is right up there with Houston and Atlanta by some measures as being the highest in the nation. So we move around a lot in Detroit. But in terms of actually getting to important places, that's a very different story. And so I'm going to show you a series of maps of trying to describe transportation in a different way. But first, let me just get you oriented. Probably everybody's familiar with some of what I'm about to say, but this is a metropolitan region, and for most metropolitan regions across the country, people interact across regional space like this. They go to jobs in different municipalities, and we are a place, of course, with profound division in our metropolitan region. So for example, poverty is highly concentrated in the central city of Detroit, and we see spatterings of it elsewhere, but for the most part, it's highly concentrated. And of course, our residential racial segregation is, if not the highest in the nation, then just behind Milwaukee. So, for example, about 85% of the city of Detroit is African American, and about 3/4 of all African Americans in the metropolitan region live in the central city of Detroit. Again, division within our region. Households without cars, similarly, are very concentrated in the central city. And when you add to this that we are also very unusually decentralized in terms of job sprawl. 4 out of every 5 jobs in the region sits more than 10 miles away from the central business district. So, well, out this far away. And when you add those things up, job decentralization, the concentration of poor households and African Americans at the core, that adds up to the greatest geographic disconnect between opportunity and vulnerable people that we see anywhere in the nation. This is another image of carlessness. So we built our region on the assumption that people could get to places by car, but we actually have a severe problem of carlessness. This is showing people who actually have jobs. So this isn't even including the most vulnerable of our populations, but these are people who have jobs but don't have a car, either because there are more workers in the household than there are cars, or because there are no cars in the household at all. And again, you see it highly concentrated in the central city. And of course, the Detroit region is quite notorious for having an unusually bad public transit system. How bad is it? Well, among the top 20 metropolitan regions by population, it ranks 19th in terms of service provided per capita. In terms of the share of commute, that is, what percentage of people actually commute to jobs by transit, we're extremely low. We rank 64th, even though we're the 8th largest metropolitan region in the nation. So transit is unusually poor in the region for a number of reasons. One of which is institutionally we've set up transit on a very unfortunate way. One is that we have 2 separate transit systems in the region. One that serves, in blue, serves primarily suburban areas, and then in red we've got DDOT, the Detroit Department of Transportation, which serves the central city. This is very unusual. So most metropolitan regions have a much more integrated system. These operate completely separately. And notice that the red one ends at the central city boundary. So all of this spatial disconnect that I've been describing works against the ability of the most vulnerable populations in the core to getting out to the suburban jobs, because it ends at the central city boundary. So transit is very unusual in our region. So now I'm coming to this idea of accessibility. Accessibility, again, is the ability to reach destinations, and we can measure that, and this map is showing scores of accessibility. So darker colored regions are the places that have the easiest ability to get to jobs, in this case. Lighter colored areas are where it's harder. And so as you'd expect, on the furthest peripheries of the region, we don't have much built up there, and so it's harder to get to jobs. But you also see that the darkest blob is actually outside of the central core, and that's quite unusual. I also study this among the top